Well, welcome everybody to this latest edition of Agree to Argue. I'm Fuz Rana, one of the co-hosts, and I'm joined by my friend Steve McCrae. So, hey, Steve, how's it going?
If I was going awesome. It's going amazing today. I'm actually having a really wonderful day.
Good. That's good to hear. Well, it's always a lot of fun to hang out with you. And today we're going to have a good time talking about the question, are religious experiences legitimate evidence for God's existence? And we're going to have some fun getting into that topic where we're going to take a look at that from two different worldview perspectives. But I would invite everybody that's watching to make sure that you are subscribed to the Agree to Argue channel on YouTube. And then also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Agree to Argue. So, Steve, let's jump right into this. I think it's safe to say that a large number of people have claimed to have had religious experiences, right? Where they claim to have encountered the divine or encountered God through these religious experiences. And, I think it's kind of interesting that scholars actually will try to catalog through a variety of different ways the different types of religious experiences that people have. For our purposes today, I'm going to suggest that we think about religious experiences in two broad categories, what we might call ordinary religious experiences and extraordinary religious experiences. So for ordinary religious experiences, this would be something like perhaps sensing God's presence when you are in a time of worship or prayer, or perhaps having an overwhelming sense of feeling compelled to act a certain way, or feeling compelled to change your behavior. Or maybe it's an insight that you might glean when you read scripture or something like that, or you have a capacity to love people or to forgive people who would be very difficult to love or difficult to forgive. Those would be the kind of ordinary religious experiences that I think a lot of people who of faith would say that they have on a fairly regular basis. And then there's also what we might call extraordinary religious experiences. For example, having a vision or hearing an audible voice from God, or sensing the presence of an entity in the room, something like that. So those would be extraordinary religious experiences. And the people that have these experiences, for them, they really do seem as if they are real experiences that many times have a transformative effect on them. Either they're more convinced that their faith is true, or they might convert as a result of these kinds of experiences, or they might just simply become better people, less selfish, more loving people as a result of these experiences. And so the question becomes, what do we do with these religious experiences? How do we make sense of them? And, to me, what I think is even more interesting is, do these religious experiences actually constitute evidence for God's existence? So Steve, what do you think as a non-theist about religious experiences?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So I'm going to try to
Of
do my
course.
best to kind of go back to where you started and kind of work my way through what you just said. Let me start off by, when talking about a religious experience, and these things are subjective, right? These things are what people have, they believe are experienced and filtered through their own sense perception, right? So as I brought to the attention of Fuzz before, I call this non-transportable justification, meaning that I can't really show Fuzz what I've experienced. I could explain it. He can say that if he's had similar experiences, but what I've actually have sensed, what I've actually have experienced personally, whether it be what you would call a minor spiritual experience, or a what's the other term you use?
Or ordinary, extraordinary,
extraordinary one. These things are something that are just, we can only evaluate. Nobody else can evaluate those subjectively, right? So they can't experience what we experience. Now, I do think it's critical to kind of differentiate between the different senses of the word evidence for our experience, and how we come to a conclusion based upon what we have to observe or what we experience. And the two types of evidence is, one, there's more of a scientific sense of the word evidence. That generally is what is the most likelihood of hypothesis being the case. right? Sometimes they can change a hypothesis to be more likely for an abductive argument or less likely. That's a general use of the term where I think a lot of people use it that way, and I have no problem with that usage. But there's also a lesser sense of the word, which is evidential, as what I'm asking you to evaluate in order to either persuade you or to think that what I've experienced is the conclusion that I've come to, right? So those kinds of evidences are a lot less towards the proposition is true or false, or a lot less towards some kind of scientific measurement. It is, hey, I'm explaining to you what I've experienced, and maybe you've experienced things similar, and you might come to the same conclusion, or vice versa. But those types of evidence are merely, hey, I'm giving you this to evaluate, right? So I think there's a huge difference in words and what I see, a sense of the word. And so what I see happening in a lot of these discussions, that people just butt heads on what they mean by evidence. So I want to get that right out of the way. Is when I say evidence for this particular discussion, I usually use it in the lesser sense, like what I'm offering. But in this discussion, I think it's probably better to talk about what is more likely is the case. Are we justified, as or I just say a theist justified to say that what they've experienced is from some kind of supernatural causation or evidence of some kind of deification. Do you agree?
Yeah. Okay, sure. Yeah. Well, and when you talk, I mean, to me, I think the linchpin of the discussion is going to be, is actually a religious experience genuinely transferable or not, right?
Yes.
I love that. By the way, I love that concept. Is this evidence transferable to another person? Should it be compelling to them? But I would argue in many respects, every kind of experience that we have, whether it's a sensory experience or a religious experience, is subjective to some sense. So, for example, in another lifetime, I worked with fragrance and flavor mixtures, and that's just fascinating chemistry, and the way your body responds through the olfactory system to chemical mixtures is really fascinating. But it's interesting because when I smell, for example, a lemon, I can tell you what chemical compounds are in that fragrance that produces kind of the lemon smell, or the lemon flavor. But what I actually experience subjectively is very different than what you would experience. We just learn that combination of smells or flavors is lemon, but what our bodies are actually detecting is very different. So in many respects, every experience that we have is really subjective, right? Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, there are clear cases of things that people will try, and they'll come up with a totally different flavor profile, or they'll say it's something sweet, where somebody else might say it's sour. So yeah, how our bodies process things like a chemical reaction, I think are completely biochemical for the most part. But yeah, those are all subjective experiences. How I taste lemon is going to be different from somebody else, possibly. But when we describe it to somebody, say, look, what is, I have a puckering, I have, I explain to people it's acidic or something like that. You're going to be like, yeah, I have those similar experiences. So we're probably going to be on the same page of what we think a lemon tastes like. But again, that is completely subjective. And I think that religious experiences are very much that way. So when we have a religious experience, and I people know that I used to be a theist. I'm no longer a theist. I'm a non-theist. I'm a Gnostic, not an atheist, agnostic. But the things that made me a theist were, a lot of it was predicated upon personal experience. Mm-hmm. That I came to the conclusion that the most reasonable explanation for this, an abductive argument, which is a type of inference to the best explanation, was because of a God. Now, I've reevaluated over the years, but back then it made sense, right? So when people say that like a theist is not justified to believe in God, I find that to be a very bad argument, only for the fact that you don't know what their justification is. Merely by saying that they don't have justification, they might have experienced things that to them concludes that God exists. I certainly did, and I wasn't irrational for doing so. I wasn't I didn't have poor critical thinking skills. I didn't have poor justification. It's just at the time, that's the conclusion that I came to, right?
Yeah. So let's take a look at this idea of an experience being non-transferable. Because, for example,
non-transportable, but either one works.
Yeah. Okay, non-transportable. Sorry. Yeah. I apologize for
That's okay. Hey, I coined one thing in my life. One thing in my life I coined non-transportable.
Yeah, and I apologize. It's actually I really
just don't tell any epistemologists. They're probably all over that and go, what? No.
So anyway. So like I had not only ordinary religious experiences, but I've had an extraordinary religious experience that was integral to my conversion to Christianity. And I'll can tell you the story if you're interested. Uh, but uh, but the point is that I had this experience that to me was really actually central to my conversion to Christianity. I don't know if I would have converted to Christianity necessarily if it wasn't for this experience. And this experience actually was so profound that it's probably the reason why I would foresee myself always remaining a committed Christian because of the power of that experience. And so, if you're saying though that I'm justified in my belief because I've had that experience, uh, then why would it not then be transportable, right? Because if it's not transportable, then are you ultimately saying or implying that person isn't truly justified in their beliefs because of that experience? It seems to me like there's got to be a connection between an idea being transportable and it genuinely being bona fide justification that should actually be transportable.
Yeah, the reason I refer to it as non-transportable justification is because that your subjective evaluation, the experience yourself, like I want to call it qualia, whatever your sense data is unique to you. You cannot say to me, hey, Steve, please come experience what I've experienced to try to evaluate it as, hey, do you think this is proper justification? You can describe it to me, right? But in the description, I think a lot of information is lost.
Yeah.
Because I'm now evaluating your description, whether you're justified, not your experience.
Right. Well, what I think is interesting is that when you actually look at the types of religious experiences that people have, and I'm going to qualify that by saying within a particular faith tradition, many times those experiences are fairly commonplace in that a large number of people will report having a similar kind of experience. And let me just tell you a quick story. Uh, uh, the experience that I had was sensing a presence in the room with me. It wasn't like a vague sense that God was present. It was almost felt like there was a person in the room with me. And this happened to coincide with me reading the Sermon on the Mount and recognizing that what Jesus is teaching here in terms of how his disciples should live a truly righteous life was true, and also recognizing that there's no way I could ever live up to those standards. And it was at that moment I had this experience that literally was critical to my conversion. It was at that point, it's like, okay, I believe that this is true. And a number of years ago, I was recounting this story at a conference in London. And afterwards, a neuroscientist came up to me and said, I had a very similar experience where I had this overwhelming sense of a real presence. And that actually was part of how I converted to Christianity, was through that. So in a sense, he actually shared with me, virtually an identical experience that was critical to his conversion. So in the same way that you and I maybe taste lemon differently, but still can come together with like a common description of what the lemon flavor is and that taste is like, I would argue that when it comes to religious experiences, that's also possible as well.
Yeah. Okay. Let me go on record. I've had similar experiences like that. Look, I've had what's called the old hag syndrome. You don't know what that is. As a lucid state where you see an old hag, which is basically a lady in gray. I've had that experience. I've seen, like a floating demon above my head in a lucid state, even though I wasn't scared of it. I didn't think it was a demon. I still think it's obviously, internalized. But I'm just, to me, in my curiosity, I wasn't scared. I was like, yeah, this is pretty cool. What's going on? But we all probably have had feelings of being, something in the room, presence, things like that. That's been ubiquitous throughout humankind for thousands of years. I don't think that anybody's really going to argue that when we say that we've had some kind of experiences, they're just going to by fiat say, no, you didn't, right? I think that's a very poor way to have a discussion. I take the principle of charity. I completely believe you 100% that you've had these experiences, right? You have to at least give an interlocutor that much respect. And unfortunately, I see a lot of people, they don't. They're like this, oh, you didn't have these experiences. But it's like, wait, I've had these types of experiences, right? We just come to different conclusions.
Mhm.
But I think a lot of it again is internalized. But your personal experience. Let me relate one of mine. That one of the reasons I converted. Um, I was head over heels in love in high school with somebody, and I was hanging out with her at her house, and her mom was experiencing headaches, and she had called the Christian missionaries over, and they anointed her head with oil, and they started saying a blessing, and I'm sitting there on the couch, and I wasn't really religious at all, matter of fact, but I mean, I was looking into it at least because she was a Christian, and so I was sitting there, and I was in prayer, and I was like like this, and all of a sudden my entire body lit up, like lit up, like if you put a bulb of 100-watt bulb in front of my eyes, you could see the pink. I could see the pink. I could feel it, and I felt like I hate to say this, but I felt like I was high, like you just lifted, and I was like, experiencing this for several, I'd say 20 seconds or so, and then I said amen, and it was gone. And the first thing I said out of my mouth was whoa. I remember that very clearly. I was 17 years of age, and I was like whoa, and people, they kind of looked at me like, what's going on? But when I asked them about it, right, they're like, oh, well, that's the Holy Ghost. So my objective argument was, okay, is that a reasonable explanation for what I've had? And of course, you cavalierly mentioned earlier to me before the burning of the bosom, right?
Yeah.
And of course, to a charismatic or a Pentecostal, they might say, oh yeah, that's the Holy Ghost, right? That because the charismatics really do believe very strongly in things like speaking in tongues and gifts of the Holy Ghost and things of that nature. But then you tell them, well, these were Mormons, these were Latter-day Saints. They're like, oh, it couldn't be that then. It was some other feel, it could have been a demonic entity. And I'm like, well, it didn't feel like a demonic. It didn't feel spiritual either to me. It literally just felt like what I described it, but I didn't feel a holy sensation. I didn't feel unholy. Didn't feel like it was Jesus. Didn't feel like it was God. Didn't feel like anything but what I described, which was just objectively what the facts were. But of course, being 17 and also being in love, and also not really understanding a lot about theology or epistemology at the time, my conclusion was, okay, this makes sense. It was the Holy Ghost. But it was weird. I always thought it was weird when I went to a testimony meeting, and you stand in front of your ward and your congregation, and you say, I know the church is true, and you're predicating of that upon your subjective evaluation of what you experienced. Now, as somebody who loves epistemology, I know that I was not justified back then to claim knowledge. Right. So when people say that I know this to be the case, I do try to undermine those justifications, because to claim knowledge requires very specific conditions. And I recognize it myself. I was not justified to claim knowledge back then. I didn't have knowledge, right? I believe, but it didn't meet the criteria for knowledge.
Right. Right. But I mean, this kind of brings up, I guess it would be called the principle of credulity. At least this is a term that I heard Richard Swinburne use, and perhaps other philosophers as well. And it's the idea that that you should, in effect, accept something as it appears to be, unless you have reason to think otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So in other
Reasons to
words,
doubt.
right, yeah. So and the principle of credulity is actually, as I've been really delving into it, is a really kind of a foundational idea in many respects to knowledge itself, right? Because at some point you've got to simply accept things as they appear to be, because if you don't, you're going to wind up essentially in this infinite regress that goes towards extreme or radical skepticism. So I mean, at some point you have to accept things as they appear to be, unless of course you've got reason to think otherwise. And so for my religious experience, my interpretation of it was that this was a divine encounter. And of course it was because I was reading from scripture at the time, and it was a transformative experience. And I never had an experience like that since, and I've never had an experience like that prior to that. So it's highly suspicious.
Yeah, well, same here. I only had that one experience, right? And it's
Yeah.
lasted years. But yeah, I like the way, I know Swinburne uses the principle of credulity, and I think that we should give people at least the opportunity to explain why they believe that is the reasoning of why they believe it's actually God. I don't find fault with theists that do that. And I also think we should extend principle charity to people when they give us these experiences. Because, like, I'm not lying when I tell people my experience. I have no reason to. I have no dog in the fight. I'm not trying to persuade anybody, clearly, as a non-theist. And I think a lot of people have had these types of experiences. And so we at least should have some credulity to accept those are real experiences and not doubt everything. Matter of fact, I don't know if you remember, but way back when, it was a very big kerfluffle of sorts on the non sequitur show about, is doubt a virtue? Because I maintain doubt is not a virtue. As a matter of fact, it's completely nonsensical to say doubt's a virtue in virtue epistemology, because you don't strive to doubt things. You don't go out of your way to say, I want to doubt things. I have to doubt things. No, you're very, Swinburne is kind of correct on that in a way. We don't want to doubt things that are true, and we don't want to doubt things unnecessarily. It's fine to have ordinary doubt, right? I mean, you tell me that you were abducted by aliens, I'm going to have some ordinary doubt. But if you tell me you bought a puppy yesterday because I know you and I know you're honest, and I'm like, oh, hey, cool. I'm not going to say, hey, where's your proof? Where's your evidence for this? That's kind of ridiculous, right? You can't go through your life in such a epistemological query mode that you have to ask people for evidence every time there's any kind of thing that they bring up as a claim, because then it bogs it down into myopic nonsense. And so, yeah, I agree with you on that there's perfectly fine to come up with an explanation or belief, as you have. But then let's continue justifying those. Is it still what I believe? Am I still justified? I constantly revisit these things.
Steve, I want to, this is producer Anastasia. I want to jump in real quick here and ask a question. Yeah, it was Slam RN that asked last show. She was like asking why I don't jump in. I said, y'all don't give me control over the buttons, and now you totally lost control. I'm here, large and in charge. No, I'm not really in charge. Y'all are in charge. But as you guys are bouncing back and forth, I kind of see like two different things, and you might need to address them both. One is with the original question being that is religious experience valid or legit? So I was kind of chewing on this and curious, like in a court of law, something that I experienced, something that I witnessed, something that I saw, something that I heard, is considered, it's given different weight, but it is considered valid evidence, maybe not self-standing. So I want to find out, Steve, from your perspective, from a non-theist perspective, is a religious experience something that's valid enough to be considered and thrown into the pot? And then, but hold that thought. And then after that, Fuz, the big question for Christians is like, if it is valid, us are giving our testimony, then why is our testimony any more valid than a Muslim who had a vision of Muhammad come to him and tell him that this is the way, or the Buddhist monks that have lots of experiences? And like Steve said, he's just been summarily dismissed of like, oh, well, no, that was Mormon, so obviously that wasn't a real experience. So Steve, if you want to jump off first with the whole thing, is it evidence to be considered? And Fuzzy, if you could pick that up afterwards.
Yeah, those are two great questions, and I'm glad that he got the latter one. So I'm going to address the first one. So you asked if it is evidence, like for a court of law and things of that nature. Yes and no, and let me qualify that very carefully here. Testimonial evidence is considered evidential, right? But the conclusions based upon testimonies are often wrong, and unfortunately, our system is set up. Our judicial system is not a theocracy. It's not based upon any kind of supernatural experiences. So in a court of law, you have to have naturalistic mentality, some kind of what's called methodological naturalism, much like science, right? So what I've actually said, let's say you had a bunch of people, they all experienced something. You had like 1,000 people say, look, they witnessed something in the sky. Okay. I think that's enough evidence to say, yes, there was an event, but the conclusion of that event, I think, would be very problematic to say what it was if people were just saying, I saw Jesus or something, right? I don't think they could reach that possible conclusion, right? I think they can say, okay, and this is one thing about thousands of years of these experiences. People for centuries, since humanity began, have had probably things like lucid dreaming, audible things like what's called hypnagogic hallucinations. I've experienced them, right? And that doesn't have anything to do with schizophrenia. It's not a mental thing. It's just when you're very, very tired, you're sleep deprived, you're going into REM sleep, you've had coffee. We've all had things that what are they called? Myclonic jerks. We've all had things where auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations. These are normal things that humans have. But I think way back when, maybe they were having these things, they didn't know how to process them. They didn't understand what we know now, but still to this day, scientists recognize that these things happen. So to answer your question, sure, if enough people said in a situation, hey, we've had this experience, I think at that point it's perfectly reasonable to believe and conclude they've had some kind of experience. It's the conclusion that from those experiences I find to be very difficult to come up with what the best abductive argument is. That goes over to Fuz though, because again, as you pointed out, other churches, other religions, other beliefs have concluded very differently than what you probably have as a Christian.
Yeah, well, you know, if I want, let me just pick up that idea of that you asked, Sia, about testimony, right? Because this is another point that Swinburne makes when it comes to the argument from religious experience, and that is the principle of testimony, that we should take as true, you know, a claim that a person makes about an experience that they have, again, unless there's reasons to think otherwise. And you know, when you look at the way people construct the argument from religious experience, what they will make that qualifier, right? They'll make the point that, look, a vast number of people have had religious experiences. It's quite possible that some of them are hallucinations. Some of them may be people that have some kind of vested interest to gain by claiming to have that religious experience. You know, some may be, you know, it may be some kind of breakdown in their sensory apparatus or some misfiring in the sensory apparatus. But usually when the argument is constructed, the point would be, but at least at minimum, some of these probably are bona fide experiences. And if that person who had that experience is interpreting it as being an encounter with the divine, then we should take that at face value until we can actually show otherwise. You know, particularly if that individual is credible, they have nothing to gain by it. You know, so for me, when I had a neuroscientist come up to me who understands hallucinations and the misfiring of the sensory systems, to say I had this experience and it was a very real experience to me, you know, that means something. I you know, from my perspective, that here's somebody who should be the least likely person to be deluded by some kind of counterfeit experience, right?
Well, can I do a quick rejoinder to that?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so a couple things. One, you know, when you have an experience like a lucid dream, it is vivid. I mean, it is like, this is experiential. There's no question about it, and you're there in the moment. It's to anybody that has never had one. There are ways of self-inducing, and they're pretty how should I say it? Convincing, right? Convincing that you are having a different reality of sorts, right? But I want to phrase this very carefully. These experiences that we have, these very lucid experiences, to me personally, right, I have to come to the conclusion as a non-believer that they are not something external. They're not being influenced to me, because then I say, okay, if they're influenced to me like some kind of external thing, how do I even come to the conclusion that happens to be a God, right? Because even if there's a God, we don't know enough about that being to say that he's going to show himself or reveal himself to us by things that could be misconstrued as a natural phenomenon, like auditory hallucinations or visual hallucinations. Matter of fact, you make a great point. There are a lot of people that are dishonest agents that will lie for their own self-gain. We all know this. We know a lot of Christians like that. It's unfortunate. And this is one of the reasons I do like RTB. I've never experienced that with any of you. And I just sincerely mean that. So I do believe very strongly that you guys actually, you know, put forth what you believe. I respect that immensely. But there are dishonest agents. We have to be aware of that. And there are also people that have misfunctionings of the mind. And I want to make it very clear that when people say things like, oh, religion is just a delusion, belief in God is a delusion, they're making a category error. Because when they're saying it's a delusion, they're saying that something is malfunctioning in the mind, right? Or even maybe physically with the brain. They're saying that something is incorrectly not working. And in epistemology, false belief does not constitute a necessity of something being wrong with the brain or mind. It's just a false belief. We all have false beliefs. Matter of fact, we live our lives all the time with false beliefs. They're called useful fictions. And so I think it's a huge category error when people start saying, well, yeah, if you believe in God, you're delusional. And I know that got started with the mind virus by Peter Boghossian, but I think that's a very huge mistake that I see people make on that.
But wait, Steve. Okay, so the people that believe in God have like mental illness. I know that we're going to be tackling that in the future, so I'm looking forward to that one. But to wrap up, what my question was is, if I can thumbnail Steve, as far as is it evidence? Is a religious experience evidence? If I understood you correctly, you're saying that you're not negating that somebody experienced something, but you're coming to, you don't have the same conclusion as to the cause of it, right?
Correct. As a matter of fact, I will point out, I actually have a PhD in neuroscience coming on my channel in about 3 hours.
Okay, so
segue to that, I could actually, we're going to be talking about something else, but maybe might this come up because I do have a neuroscientist.
So for the blonde chick here, which I probably just made half of our audience mad by, being like the gender and the hair color and just defaming myself like that. But that being said, can you bottom line it for me? That doesn't tell me if you think it's evidence. Does that mean no, you don't think it's evidence?
Okay, bottom line is it is evidence for the individual. See, this is where I think people get confused with the whole burden of proof thing, right? Because all they know about the burden of proof is that they've learned off some cable access TV channel, and they don't have a decent understanding of what's called a epistemological justification is. And so a burden of proof or a burden of justification is just your reasons why you believe or don't believe something. And so when you're asking me, is it evidence? It's evidence to me. This is why I say it's non-transportable evidence, because I cannot show you the subjectivity of my own personal experience, right? I can only describe it to you, then you have to evaluate the description. So is it evidence? Yes, to oneself. Is it evidence to somebody else? That's up to them to decide whether it's sufficient evidence for them to be convinced. Like I said, if Fuz said, hey, I bought a dog, I need very little evidence to convince me of that. In fact, I probably need nothing except for his word, because I have a rapport with him. I know he's honest, and so I'm not going to doubt him on that. But is it when he says, "Hey, Steve, Jesus came down, we had lunch together," I'm probably going to be a little bit more dubious of that. There's going to be obviously some incredulity there, not because I don't trust him, but I would like to know, why he thinks that. But is his experience something that I can say is evidence to me? Well, no.
Okay, so it could be something that's like a self-fulfilling evidence, but not something that can be presented to somebody else as evidence.
Yeah, because there's no objective standard to that.
Okay,
right?
and then Fuz, you kind of seem to go on the same path as Steve, and so I wanted to get clarity from you as well, that you sounded like you're saying you're not negating that that some people are having a true legitimate experience, that maybe it's not to mental health challenges, or that they're falsifying something, but they legitimately had an experience. But again, who's the determiner as to if that is a valid experience of the God of the Bible or their own respective deity?
Yeah. And I just want to point out before I take on that question, I'm not trying to evade it. And that is that just because you can point to examples where clearly somebody was having a hallucination, or somebody was being, dishonest about the experience that they had, or somebody may have had some kind of, again, brain or mind phenomena that produced that experience, doesn't mean that everyone who's had that experience can be accounted for it that way. And so it's the vast number of people that have religious experiences. And again, within a particular faith tradition, it's the fact that those experiences seem to be highly reproducible, in that a lot of people seem to have those same kinds of experiences.
There's some subjectivity to it.
Yeah, are they reproducible? I mean, if they're subjective, then I don't see the replication.
It's reproducible in the sense that that individual is not an isolated individual with that experience, but there are other people who report a similar experience and interpret that experience in a similar way, right?
Okay, well, like I experience dreams. You experience dreams. Sia has dreams. Everybody dreams. What causes those dreams? That's a huge question that scientists don't know, right?
But Steve, you as a former LDS, I think that there's something that's reproducible right there. By the way, just side note, and then I'll let Clark let me go dark here again. But the chat is blowing up with a side conversation completely unrelated about hell. So we're going to put a pin in that. I think that would be an awesome conversation to have later. I want you guys to know that that's kind of blowing up on the side, and let's maybe discuss bringing that in as a conversation later. But so okay, I lost my train of thought. Say something brilliant, Fuz. Quick, save me.
Well, I was just gonna say we've all experienced hell. It's called Facebook.
No. Okay, so the burning in the bosom. So the reproducible, like within the Christian community, there's of course the different sects of Protestant Christianity, and like you can have the charismatics that have or Pentecostals that have this experience that causes them to fall down and be slain in the spirit. And so this is like a broad religious experience that to them is evidence. But if we take it to LDS, which most of Protestant Christianity does not recognize as valid, that they will tell you to pray for a burning in the bosom. This is a broad experience within the Mormon community. So again, does that validate it, the breadth of those experiences? And then Clark, you can turn me out.
And we also see, though, with the whole Pentecostal, the slain in spirit, we see people like Benny Hinn and those kind of evangelists that do fake false healings, which, by the way, I am very much against all these healers. I'm sorry. I think they're all quacks. I think they're all con men. I think they should be charged in cases where they tell people to, get rid of their medicine and just, believe on faith, and then they tell people, well, when they obviously their symptoms come back because they're in some kind of endorphin euphoria or something, that they're like, oh, well, you just didn't believe hard enough. It to me is an outright scam. But I will go on record to say, if there are such a things as actual healings, I don't believe in a God that would exist that makes them so grandiose. Now, granted, he supposedly did in the Bible, but maybe that was just to kind of show his abilities. But I don't think somebody who's making millions of dollars by faith healing is somebody that God's going to be revealing of some kind of magical power from, and I hate to use the word magic, but to them, it's to a non-believer, they do call this magic. I don't, by the way. I think that whole thing about calling it magic or calling it sky daddy, which I think we're going to get into it in another slight episode coming up, is a bad way of looking at it. And so, yeah, I think that these experiences we can show have natural causations to them. People just getting, in the moment, or they're just experiencing what they think they're supposed to experience, and they go through the motions. We know this does happen.
Right. Well, and let me take on. There's a lot to unpack here. So,
it is, right?
But let me take on the question that Sia raised, and she's raising her hand. I don't know what that means, but 5 minutes. Oh, great. But in terms of why is it that people from different faith traditions have differing religious experiences, or how could all these different faith perspectives have religious experiences? And I'll point out that there could very well be some religious experiences that people have in certain faith traditions that actually very well could be induced by hallucinogens or entering into some kind of hypnotic state. And they would interpret that as a religious experience. But in fact, we could actually go in and demonstrate that this is probably some kind of physiological phenomena. Also, I think that there is pressure within faith traditions to have religious experience. I actually am comfortable around people that are Pentecostals and charismatics. I lean in that direction myself when it comes to the praxis of my faith. But I also have been around people who actually get kind of quote unquote accolades for having these kind of religious experiences. And so there's this peer pressure that they have to claim to have these experiences, when they necessarily, aren't really having a bona fide religious experience, and it could very well be that and I don't want to presume this, I'm just suggesting this, is that it could very well be that for someone who's in the LDS tradition who wants to believe and is instructed to pray for this burning in the bosom, actually out of peer pressure seems to have that kind of experience, or some kind of an event that they interpret as being that burning in the bosom. But that doesn't mean that that because of that there's not actually bona fide religious experiences where people are actually experiencing God. And another possibility too is that people are actually experiencing God, but because they live in a particular cultural context, or they're familiar with a particular faith tradition, that the way they describe that experience is within that faith tradition, or within the language of that faith tradition. Because, and this is a whole nother topic for probably another show. But, I actually believe that when a Muslim prays to God, they actually are praying to God. Now the way they interpret that is within their Islamic theology, but I believe they actually are praying to God, right? If there's a one true singular God and somebody is praying to God, then that's who they're praying to. They may not, they may pray in different ways, theologically speaking, and they may interpret what's going on differently in theological terms. But so just because, again, people of different faith traditions are having that experience doesn't necessarily mean that's reason to dismiss that as being a bona fide experience of God. It could just be, again, how they choose to describe it using the limited experience and language that they have available to them.
So your basically analogy would be they're all dialing different phone numbers, but getting the same person answering.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Okay. But by the way, I didn't. The experience I had was, well before I even had read the Book of Mormon or any kind of interest in it whatsoever, except for the fact that I knew she was. But so I mean, I didn't have an expectation, right? I mean, it wasn't like I expected to have that feeling. But I could definitely see what you're saying on that. Yeah. Okay, so, we have some questions.
Yeah.
I believe.
Steve, you want to drive?
Do they see? Do you want to ask the questions, or you just want me to read them and
weep?
Yeah. How do you want to do? You want to ask us the questions?
Did I not mute my thing the whole time? You've been hearing me typing.
No.
I'm new here. What am I gonna say?
Welcome to new YouTube. Who dis?
This this is why you wouldn't let me touch the buttons before. All right. What we got here? We got Heather Lands is asking if religious experience isn't legit evidence, how would one account for multiple people experiencing a religious experience about the same thing in different places?
Well, again, are they experiencing the same thing? There might be an actual causation, actual event, but how people interpret that event is going to be subjective through their own sense data, which again, we are asking, what is the best explanation? What is the best, going back 2,000 years, no offense, but none of us were around during those days. We didn't see people walking out of graves. We didn't see a person rising from the dead 3 days later. We're relying on people that were there to say, this is what they experienced. This is how they interpreted it. Now, I think that a lot of them did experience certain things, but that doesn't mean that the explanation that they're giving is the best explanation given that we know about things now. I mean, obviously there has to be some kind of miraculous overtone to these things, right? People know biologically you're not going to come back from the dead, but they suspend that and say, well, this was a miracle. I'm fine with that, right? I mean, because again, that is a logical possibility. People have to differentiate between a physical or biological impossibility versus a logical possibility. Coming back from the dead, there's nothing illogical about that, believe it or not. But is that the best explanation? So when we see certain things, especially if we don't know, like we say illusions, or we see an event, we don't know how to explain it, our minds constantly want to have an explanation. And of course, back then they were very, very, religious, very, I hate to say it, but a lot of superstitions. Maybe they just came to the wrong conclusions, perhaps. And I think that's the way a lot of non-believers do think of it that way. They just think that, yes, they had these experiences. Yes, they believe they've seen things. Most non-believers that are educated, are not mythicists. They do think Jesus existed, but they don't think that he actually was the Son of God, obviously, or so they would be a theist or a believer. And so their reasoning is that, okay, these people had experiences, but they didn't come to the most reasonable, abductive conclusion.
I think that's an interesting question that's posed, and I'm of the opinion that a religious experience is actually analogous to a sensory experience. And so, like, let's say I said, "Hey, Steve, last night when I looked in the sky, it was purple," and we both, recognize that there's probably no mechanism we can think of that would produce a purple sky. And so you might be skeptical that I actually, saw.
A cannabis farm would actually.
Yeah.
Believe it or not. Don't ask if I know these things, but yes, a cannabis farm would produce a purple sky, or has been actually. You can go look that up.
Okay. But anyway,
Just saying. Yeah, that's how. Yeah, that's what my conclusion would be.
Okay. So
did you see the squirrel?
Just work with me here. So we might say, look, we know that there's no mechanism that we can think of to produce a purple sky. Therefore, you probably had some kind of glitch in your you were seeing things, or your eyes weren't working correctly, or something like that. But then if somebody else said, "Hey, I saw a purple sky as well," that now becomes corroboration. If somebody said, "Hey, I took a picture and the sky was purple," and we could employ radical skepticism and say, "Well, how do we know that other person has reliable?"
Well, Northern Lights. I mean, people see Northern Lights, right? But they had no idea how Northern Lights were produced.
Right.
None.
So likewise, I would argue that if you have multiple people having the same kind of religious experience and are interpreting it in the same way, or if they're having the same experience of the same phenomena in different locations as this person is posing, that to me would actually represent corroboration that it was a real experience.
Right. Yeah, no, corroboration that was a real experience. So again, the conclusion, again, if you and I had seen these Northern Lights, they pretty miraculous. I mean, people see lights in the sky, they're going to go, "Wow, this is like incredible. What's causing these things?" And you try to explain to them 2,000 years ago about ionization and radiation belts and stuff like that. They'd be like, "Yeah, we have no idea what you're talking about." But we both had the same experience. We're both looking at it going, "Yeah, there's beautiful lights in the heavens."
So yeah, so that just goes along the lines of fire and when the movie Camelot, when he had the lighter or whatever, the match, and it's like, and people are like, "Oh," or when he knew that that there was going to be an eclipse, and everybody just
exactly.
So Fuzzled, the parallel universe is asking, can God use dreams or hallucinations to send a message? I think that's an interesting choice of two terms there, dreams or hallucinations. You might want to unpack that a bit.
Yeah, well, that really becomes kind of a theological question, I guess, about how would God reveal himself to people. And so, I think there's examples in scripture where God has used dreams to communicate with people. I don't know that there was instances in scripture where there was a hallucination that God was using to communicate. So I would say dreams, yes, as a Christian theist, but hallucinations, no.
I believe there's a scripture about sending strong delusions. Wasn't there?
There is a scripture about sending strong delusions, but that's a delusion is not necessarily, that's more mental than it is visual, where hallucination is more visual.
Yeah. So, I think hallucinations are a type of delusion, are they not?
But
I don't know. Like I said, I asked my neuroscience tonight.
And then you're also getting into the weeds of who determines if it's a vision versus a hallucination.
Yeah, I think it's an ineffective form of communication, though, right? I mean, especially because we know people can actually have hallucinations, and if God wants to send a message, it's probably not the most convincing way to do it. Especially to someone like myself, who's what's called a non-resistant non-believer, going to the problem of divine hiddenness, that would not be a very effective mean.
I think that the best way, if you really wanted to communicate, I think would be to come in the flesh and actually come to our planet and walk among us. But I don't know. We'll get into that.
That'd be cool. Hey, look, I'm not against that. That'd be really cool. I'm not one of these people who are like, they'd be like, "Oh, well, I don't want Jesus to exist."
Only that would happen. But if it did, they'd probably just kill him anyway. Okay, so
they didn't succeed the first time, but try again. Is that what you're saying? That they're gonna do?
All right. Scientific science asked the question. Let me see who this is going to be for.
Oh, is that Edgar? That's Edgar, ain't it?
So I think the question is, how can we differentiate a scientific experience to a religious experience. I'm not even sure which one of you gents wants to
Oh, I'll
pick that
take
up.
this one. If
Go,
this
Steve.
is Edgar, Mr. Intelligent Design, if I'm not mistaken. There is a huge difference between scientific experience and religious experience. Obviously, religious experience is predicated upon having some kind of non-natural explanation for a natural phenomenon. Science itself is predicated upon a philosophy called methodological naturalism. In other words, they cannot find a supernatural causation. They can't even start with a supernatural causation. There's a lot of reasons for that. One, you don't want to go into a scientific experiment going, okay, pixies did this, right? Or leprechauns did this. Or you can come up with an infinite number of possible supernatural causations. It eliminates all those by fiat. Plus, science comes from natural theology or natural sciences, where we want to say, here, we've observed something naturally. What is a possible abductive explanation for what we're observing, which is a natural explanation? It's removed from any kind of supernatural causations. It's a matter of fact, it can't even address supernatural causations or God claims. Now, can it find something to an explanation as, let's say, like you see a statue bleeding, out of his eyes or something, like, or Jesus, or from the hands? Yeah, science can look at that and go, yeah, this was, not blood, this was some other thing. They can address that, but they can never conclude that it actually was some kind of supernatural manifestation. So when we talk about religious evidence allows for those types of conclusions. Science does not.
I don't know that I would disagree with you, Steve, but I would say that in effect, though, the same type of reasoning that you would use to establish a scientific phenomena could be used in effect to establish, again, something as being a bona fide religious experience, though. And it goes back to this idea of the principle of testimony and, the principle of credulity, because, let's say that I'm making an observation as a scientist, and now I am working in my lab by myself, and I record that observation, and then I present it to the public at large, saying, hey, I observed this particular phenomena under these conditions, and you are taking at my word that I actually made that observation, right? You're unless you have reason to think otherwise, you're assuming that I made an observation, even if that observation goes against the prevailing scientific framework of the time. You still are saying, yes, we believe you have that observation. And of course, if somebody else, again, has that observation, that adds corroboration, or if I provide additional evidence. But again, you're still assuming that other person is reliably and truthfully reporting the observation they had. You're assuming that anybody that's presenting data is presenting it in a truthful way, in a truthful way. So, you're utilizing this idea of principle of testimony, principle of credulity, and likewise, the argument would be that somebody having a religious experience, who claims to have had that experience and claims that it's from God, because I would argue that I don't know that it's actually you're interpreting that experience as coming from God, but that the nature of the experience itself is suggestive that it's coming from God. So, for example, if I know something about what the sun is, and so if I say, hey, I looked into the sky and I experienced the sun, I know something about who God is, and so if I say, hey, I experienced God, or I had this experience and I think that experience was of God, I know something about God that helps me or suggests to me that experience is best interpreted as essentially a divine encounter.
Yeah, but the umbrage I have with that is that because we are looking for scientific explanations, right? If you listen, like, I had talked about the electron transport chain or something like that, right? Which is an amazing thing. I mean, I'm not going to front. It's really fascinating. It's one of my favorite things in biology. But when we're looking for an explanation of why that works, we don't default to, oh, God did this, right? And I think that's much more of a theological or philosophical explanation for a base level, right? I mean, if you're looking for the foundation of everything, the ultimate causations, the ultimate explanations, which I'm not sure exist, but let's say that it does, the theist tries to posit some kind of divine being that came up with all this as a what we've talked about before, as a teleological explanation. But in science, we're not looking for that. We're not looking for the root cause. We're looking for a causational mechanism by which we can explain it using natural means because that's what we have to go by. That's what we have to evaluate. Just by positing God to explain biological functions doesn't get you anywhere as far as proving what we understand about biology, right? Doesn't not going to help us in any way by saying, oh, well, God created the ETC. Okay, let's assume that. Does it tell us anything about how the electron transport works, how it was evolved over, several millennia? Of course not. But that's why I don't think it's a scientific question. I mean, we can posit anything for an explanation. That's fine if people do that. I really don't have a problem with that. But in science, you're not going to be positing these things as an explanation because they're not going to help you understand why those things exist any better by positing those things. It's much different. It's a completely different domain of discourse, I think.
Yeah, and again, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I guess my point is that the same kind of reasoning that we use in science, we can actually use when people claim to have religious experiences to conclude that they're bona fide experiences. And I would agree with you that when it comes to science, if we are employing methodological naturalism as the framework by which we're engaging in science, and of course, any kind of appeal to the supernatural would not be, a legitimate scientific explanation. But in a sense, you could argue that is maybe a necessary but an artificial restriction on the types of explanations that you would allow in science. But on the other hand, if somebody's claiming a religious experience, obviously you don't want to be employing methodological naturalism to interpret that experience. Although it could very well be that there is a natural explanation for that experience, but you want to be open to allow for the possibility of the supernatural. So to me, I think that your distinction seems to be the philosophical framework in place to interpret the evidence that comes,
correct,
but not so much the quality of how you would reason.
Yeah. So Fuz.
Yeah, and I don't have a problem with that approach, but I would only add that there's multiple different approaches that can be just one of many people can use for these things. But yeah, I don't have a problem with that approach.
Wait, we're missing the Q part of the Q&A part, so we got to.
Oh, is there more Q? Okay.
No, there's a lot more Q's coming
Go for
up.
It.
So I got another question here, but Fuz, what you were saying about like basically can science detect the supernatural? I think that is an upcoming episode where you're going to be digging into that. So you get
our December program.
Yes, our December program, we're going to be talking about that. And we got about 10 more minutes and about 4 more questions. And I'm going to totally rabbit trail before I jump to the legitimate questions. Not that this is illegitimate, but over in the chat, Slam RN is excited to hear that you're working on a book, and she wants a sneak peek preview as to what it's about. And just super short, and then I'll jump to the real questions over here.
The working title of the book is Fit for a Purpose, and the manuscript is completed, so it's now in the peer review stage. And the premise of the book is that there is a biochemical anthropic principle that is compatible and complements the anthropic principle that we see in cosmology. So that's the book in a nutshell. It's an argument from design.
Thank you.
And by the way, I do subscribe to the weak anthropic principle, if that matters.
It does.
The strong, no, not so much, but yeah.
Not the strong, but the weak. Okay.
Everything's weak. Everything's to me is I usually go weak. The strong is usually on most things are too much for me to justify. But anyways.
So back to the cues. Mm-hmm. Back to the cues. Our same friend, Scientific Science, has a second question, and then we have 3 more after that. We'll see what we get to. How can we know if evidence is intentional or non-intentional? I'm not sure if that is a philosophical term.
It is.
Non-intentional.
Intentionality.
Yeah, I don't understand the questions.
Yeah, intentionality would basically like an agent has intent, right? There's actually intention and intention with an S, but those we completely different things. But I think he's referring to intentional states. So in other words, how would you know that evidence would be something that would be leading to a mind? His name is Intelligent. Edgar's known as Mr. Intelligent Design. So he's a very pro ID. I disagree with him on 99% of everything. But that's what he's asking. He's asking, how do we know if something's designed or not? How do we know there's an intentionality behind what we see? And we had actually discussed this on a prior episode. And to me, it's one of the things you have to ask yourself is, if this is designed with intentionality, can we explain it without intentionality, right? This is a whole argument that we had about teleologic versus teleologic. But I always argue, if you're going to have an abductive argument that a mind created certain things, you have to at least have the basis that we've seen disembodied minds create things, which we have not. Every instance of anything created has always been through a mind that exists with a physical substrate called a brain, every single instance. And so the arguments that I have against any kind of intelligent design is simply that you're positing a mind that exists sans a brain, which is obviously something we've never observed before. So that in and of itself, to me, is a major problem I have with some kind of teleological explanation, or something that has intent to create something.
That's wow. I almost feel like that's a other question or another conversation to have later. We have so many, because the idea of God like being this bodiless mind, and it's like, just because the Christian view of God is not necessarily material. I don't know. Just this, it's an interesting idea for another time. We have George Herrickson, a friend of ours here, and Fuz, I'm gonna have to have you help me with this, okay? Because George likes the 25-cent words. So
George is a philosopher and a theologian, and so good friend. And he's basically saying phenomenologist.
yes,
Phenomenologist. Let's say phenomenologism. Yeah,
And philosophers suggest
phenomenalism. It's phenomenalism.
Yeah, suggests three kinds of religious experiences. Only one is sensory thoughts, visual or sensory experiences, numinous experiences, and mystical experiences. And when I was reading about the philosophy of religious experiences, and Norm Geisler has several really good chapters on this in his book that he wrote with Wynne Corrigan called The Philosophy of Religion. There's like 3 or 4 chapters on this. He gets into this very complex discussion about the nature of religious experiences from a philosophical standpoint that I honestly wasn't able to completely track with. So George, sadly, I'm going to have to punt, and I'm going to fail to do your extremely important point justice. If only George was here, he could regale us.
I could try to give it a shot.
Enormous insight.
I could try to
We're
give
going
it
to
a
have
shot.
to bring George on this show sometime.
The problem I have, okay, so there are some reasons to accept phenomenalism, okay? And phenomenalism is basically an epistemological approach that how we can know things is strictly through sense data, right? Because everything we experience is filtered through some kind of biological filter. Everything we have is sensory. I mean, we have no choice about that. That's how we exist as a biological agent. However, obviously there are other forms of epistemological conditions where we can have non-experiential a priori knowledge to know things. You know, we don't experience things like the laws of logic, even though we can describe them, right? We can describe them and claim, okay, this is the law of non-contradiction, but they're nothing that we experience. They're a priori knowledge. And so phenomenalism is basically predicated on the approach that knowledge is only acquired through what we can experience. And there is some truth to that, obviously. But as he points out, he's way more versed in this than I am, sure, because his question's right on point. Our visual sensations, right? Even when we talk about knowledge, there's something called a causal theory of knowledge, right? When we see something that produces a brain state, it causes an effect. And so there's a causal theory that relates to something that's in the real world. And so there's a very strong relationship between knowledge and epistemology to what we actually experience, what we actually see, such as the causal theory of knowledge. And so, yeah, there's different types of experience that we're going to experience. It's different types of relationships. And as he points out, the fact that we all have similar experiences, we all have the phenomenon of what we experiences. Yes, we've all agreed that those experiences do exist, but as go back full circle to what Fuz was saying earlier, sure, we all know what lemon tastes like, but do we all experience it the same way? You can't answer that question. That's, to me, is something we just take, quote, on faith. I hate to say it, but it is. Yeah, it's a properly basic belief in some source, is that our subjectivity, our qualia, our or if not, you end up with solipsism, right? I mean, if we don't accept that other minds exist that experience things just as we can, doesn't mean they have to experience it the same way. We have to accept as a condition of rationality that other minds exist, or else I'm just talking to myself, and that's not very rational right now.
I'm sorry, I'm dying on that one. That was
take it on faith.
But I love the pregnant pause when it's like, oh, I'm just talking to myself.
now I'm reevaluating this.
That was just fantastic. Well, I think that's actually gonna wrap us up. I know that there's a couple of things I am really looking forward to next month, next month, when we are going to bring out the big guns and address, is God pro-slavery? And Steve, you're bringing a friend on for that. Can you unpack a little bit what we'll be talking about next month?
I'm bringing on a friend named Dr. Josh Bowen. He is part of Digital Haparami, a channel that came out of the Non Sequitur show. He has written a book on slavery, and he advocates for the position that slavery was not only condoned back then, that God actually gave the conditions for slavery. And as somebody who really loves the topic of ethics, was it ethical for a benign or benevolent being to not to say outright slavery is wrong? You shouldn't do this. I mean, he puts don't eat shellfish seemingly over the slave enslavement of Jews. And so he's going to come on and kind of discuss from a biblical perspective, because this is his expertise. It's actually, I believe, it's Syriology, but he's a biblical expert, that it wasn't just like indentured servitude. It was actually slavery. It was treated as slavery, and it was given supposedly by God how to treat your slave.
And any other, there's so many things I'm like, oh, I want.
Yeah, by the way, I'm way out of my depths on that one next month. That's why I'm bringing him on.
Yeah, no, because I know that there's a lot of arguments about that. Like I said, this is going to be a really, really big talk, like especially with the climate right now. So
I agree.
So y'all want to wrap us up and let people know how they can stay connected to us? You know what? Before you do that, Steve and Fuz, I just wanted to remind people that us old folks that used to be so excited for the reminders that came when you were subscribed to a channel, that I used to get emails that said, hey, that new content was uploaded. And of course, Google isn't doing that anymore ever since August.
Yeah.
So what I would like to invite folks to do is to visit our website, agreetoargue.com, and you can subscribe to ATA emails there. And when we got new content coming up, when we're posting clips, or when we have the next episode that we're discussing, you want to know about that and we want that in your inbox, just sign up there. We're not going to inundate you. We're just going to keep you posted. So other than that, guys, how do they stay in touch with us and maybe even give us some ideas for future shows?
Yeah, well, and again, I would just say, hey, please subscribe to Agree to Argue on the YouTube channel. And then also you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at Agree to Argue. And please let people know about this program and help us to share content through your social media accounts with your friends and followers. That would be much appreciated. And we're going to have a bonus segment that will be released later on this month, called for Underneath the Banner of the Good, the Bad, and the Huh. And we're going to be talking about the invisible sky daddy. Is that a good challenge to people who hold to belief in God, that they just essentially are believing in the invisible sky daddy? So I guess that's a wrap. And so we thank you so much for watching. And if you got suggestions for future shows, future topics, we would love to hear from you. What you think might be fun to hear Steve and I discuss. And if you got ideas also for people that could appear on the show as guests, to help facilitate and engage us on these topics. We would love to hear your suggestions. So please don't hesitate to communicate those ideas to us. So I guess until next time, I hope everybody can agree to argue with those that are part of your friends and family, but do so in a way that is civil and really promotes understanding. So until next time.